Hi, I'm Eric Lieberg. I'm a volunteer with the Snohomish County Health and Safety Network. I'm pleased to be here today to give you a quick video introduction to adverse childhood experiences, or what's come to be known as ACEs. The ACEs study has implications for schools, for health care, for employers, for parents, and for service providers in all areas of human services.
The original ACE study, conducted in the mid-90s, surveyed over 17,000 who belonged to the Kaiser Permanente Health Plan in San Diego, California, about their lives.
What the ACE survey told us was that exposure to traumatic childhood experiences has a major influence on lifetime mental and physical well-being. ACEs cause or contribute to many of our most expensive social and health problems, and the frequency of these ACEs transcends economic class.
It is important to note that most of the people taking part in this initial study were middle class and had excellent health insurance.
The Washington State Family Policy Council was created in 1992 by the legislature to address expensive problem behaviors before they impacted existing systems. The FPC was a whole new way to approach big problems by emphasizing community solutions. For the past decade, the Family Policy Council has worked with Dr. Vincent Folletti from Kaiser Permanente and Dr. Robert Anda from the Centers for Disease Control, the principal investigators for the ACE study. In addition, the Family Policy Council has invested heavily in expanding the scope of the study by including ACE questions on the Washington State Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Study.
It took me until my mid to late 50s to begin to understand how my own adverse childhood experiences had affected me in my daily life. I was physically abused as a child. I was sexually abused as a child. My dad was an alcoholic. I had a family member who was mentally ill. For most of my life as a child and young adult, I thought sort of everybody thought the way that I did. I've struggled with depression throughout my life. Other physical ailments that are probably not attributable to heredity or to lifestyle. So what has been meaningful for me in understanding adverse childhood experiences is to look back in my life and recognize those times when there were people in my life that helped me with with the consequences of the ACEs that I experienced. I think the message here is that adverse childhood experiences are not something that doom us necessarily, but something that will show up in our life emotionally and physically, and that with the right kind of support, the right kind of intervention, can be mitigated so that people can live successful, productive lives.
We have known for a long time that both genetics and experience affects how we develop into adults. The ACE study tells us that experience, especially in childhood, has a much bigger impact.
Research into brain development also underscores the role of experience. Excessive levels of hormones related to stress cause real change in the way a young person's brain develops. Stress is important for development, but ongoing stress, or stress that's unpredictable, can adversely affect development and actually rewire the brain in ways that make it less effective for the young person to fit into society. Because of the way that young brains develop, different types of maltreatment at different times in the childhood affect different functions of the brain. Certain types of maltreatment are especially bad during certain sensitive periods.
For example, while emotional abuse is always a bad thing, it does even more harm to a young person between the ages of 7 and 9, affecting development of new speaking and writing skills, and making a person much more susceptible to depression and committing suicide.
We have known for a long time that people who engage in risky behaviors tend to have more social problems, more disease, and often die earlier.
The ACE study has started to fill the gaps between childhood experiences, early impairment, and the adoption of those risky behaviors. So what do we mean when we say ACEs? We mean serious maltreatment and family dysfunction.
Maltreatment is child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, child emotional abuse, and neglect.
Family dysfunction is mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person in the home, drug-addicted or alcoholic family member, witnessing domestic violence against the mother, parental discord indicated by divorce, separation, or abandonment, incarceration of any family member.
So if a person was physically abused as a child, had an alcoholic parent, and their parents got divorced, they would have an ACE score of 3 because they would have experienced 3 separate ACEs categories.
ACEs are what scientists call a dose-response system, meaning the more categories of adverse childhood experiences a person has, the larger the likely impact on their long-term health.
Here are a couple of really dramatic examples of what we're talking about. Intravenous drug use, that is, using a needle to inject illicit drugs, is almost unheard of among people with an ACE score of 0. Their incidence of intravenous drug use is less than 0.3%. But people with an ACE score of 4 or more have a rate of 3.5%.
Suicide is even more dramatic. People with an ACE score of 4 or more are 4,600% more likely to attempt suicide at some time in their lives.
ACEs are very common. In the average Washington State classroom of 30 students, 6 will have no ACEs, 5 will have 1 ACE, 6 will have 2 ACEs, 3 will have 3 ACEs, 7 will have 4 or 5 ACEs, and 3 will have 6 or more ACEs.
So you can see from this, ACEs are very expensive for our society. ACEs are also a major factor in disability. A person with a high ACE score is nearly 3 times as likely to have limited mobility due to physical, mental, or emotional problems.
They are also 3 times as likely to have health conditions that require special equipment and are 8 times as likely to have missed 14 or more days of work in the last month.
ACEs are a factor in many of the most expensive chronic diseases. High ACE scores increase the rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, and cardiovascular disease.
As you can see from this graphic, researchers have been able to attribute high percentages of many problems to adverse childhood experiences. These represent huge costs to our healthcare system and to employers through lost productivity and increased health insurance costs. One of the most worrisome aspects of ACEs is that they can be passed down from one generation to the next.
Young people with high ACE scores often adopt behaviors that make them prone to creating ACEs for their own children. In addition, parenting is a skill that is learned, often from our own parents.
So what can we do about it? The good news is that we know a lot about what communities can do to reduce ACE transmission between generations and to improve outcomes for people with high ACE scores.
Research tells us that these high-capacity communities do 4 very specific things. They come together to focus on matters of local importance. They learn together and generate opportunity and stability. They share responsibility for developing the community that they want to live in and the results currently produced by combined efforts. And they expand leadership roles, inviting people from different classes, life experiences, and ethnicities to lead in the formal and informal helping systems.
In Washington State, we see that these high-capacity communities are reducing the impact of ACEs.
For example, young people ages 18 to 34 with between 3 to 8 ACEs are more than 3 times less likely to suffer from serious mental illness if they live in a high-capacity community.
Individuals have the ability to succeed despite high ACE scores and to reduce the transmission of ACEs to their own children.
This has been called resiliency, and there are 3 main components that help to make a person resilient.
Community matters. Having a sense of meaning, being engaged, having positive supports, and having a family with positive standards and high expectations, even if it is a chosen family. Capability matters. Having the skills to participate in everyday life, the ability to regulate emotion and behavior when stressed out, the ability to think flexibly, having a positive self-view, and the ability to advocate for yourself.
Belonging matters, having strong bonds with caregivers, positive relationships with competent adults, and friends who provide security and belonging.
There are many opportunities to make changes in the policies and procedures of our institutions that can acknowledge the impact of ACEs and find ways to work that improve positive outcomes for many of our citizens.
I first learned about ACEs as a volunteer at the Snohomish County Health and Safety Network. You've heard earlier in this presentation about how emotional abuse can affect the speech and writing and listening abilities of young people, even when they become adults. At the time, I was working with the Washington State Department of Corrections as a probation and parole officer or community corrections officer in downtown Seattle with a caseload of people who were homeless, with violent criminal histories. They had mental illness problems, and they were also drug addicts. I would watch the typical response of probation officers telling the offender to sit down, be quiet, and answer questions. And then they would tell them, come back next Tuesday at 10:45 and bring verification that you've entered into and got an evaluation done at the drug treatment program, and don't be late. Okay, you can leave now. Often when approached in that way, offenders wouldn't return. Warrants would be issued, they'd be arrested, and a lot of community resources would be wasted. From ACEs, I began to understand that most of these offenders were probably emotionally abused between ages 7 and 9. In other words, their auditory cortex, their ability to hear and understand what they heard, was negatively affected by their ACEs. So instead of taking the traditional approach, I would talk to the offenders and I would repeat in a slow manner what I wanted them to do. I'd create a friendly atmosphere so that they didn't feel threatened or stressed. And then I would ask them to repeat when it was they were going to be returning, and I would write down on a card for them when it was that they would return and what they needed to do. My success was phenomenal. In fact, I had other officers commenting, asking how was it that I could get offenders to cooperate so successfully. All I was actually doing was applying the things that I had learned about ACEs in my approach with this very difficult offender population.
Citizens and agencies throughout Washington State have stepped up. Many counties have engaged in the long-term work of becoming a high-capacity community, and many more are on their way.
Agencies are also increasing access to parenting classes and parental support to reduce ACEs transmission. And communities are working hard to provide opportunities for young people to acquire the building blocks of resiliency with youth councils, peer education, and other teams. Recognition of ACEs creates an opportunity for parents, for youth, for schools, and communities to identify what holds us back.
New research on how people become resilient informs us on what we can do to help create capacity. Much has been done, but there is more to do. What can you do to help in your neighborhood, school, or community?